Truth number 2. The Deathly Hallows are real. To start us off, the most obvious point is the huge wealth of evidence we see in the good books about the Deathly Hallows. From breaking into Dumbledore's grave to retrieve a wand, which is more than it seems, to receiving a golden snitch that is also more than it seems, to wondering why an invisibility cloak passed down from Harry's father is highly durable and never loses its powers of invisibility. We've all read how Harry, Hermione, and Ron have collected, used, and disposed of each of the Deathly Hallows. We've certainly read an awful lot of detail about multiple people manipulating these objects for something that's apparently only a legend. But let's say that all of this cannot be proven to be true. Let's just discard all that. Consider another point then. The dissuading tone of Dumbledore's commentary in the Tales of Beedle the Bard. He says, and I quote, "In spite of the fact that according to Beedle, 2 of the 3 objects are highly dangerous, in spite of the clear message that death comes for us all in the end, a tiny minority of the wizarding community persists in believing that Beedle was sending them a coded message, which is the exact reverse of the one set down in ink, and that they alone are clever enough to understand it." You can see that although he's indulgent of these people when he earlier says that hope springs eternal for them, ultimately he's doing his best to discredit the seekers of the Deathly Hallows in a very public forum. Discrediting true believers by tying their belief to an inability to distinguish fact from fiction is a very common counterintelligence technique. You can see through his commentary that Dumbledore is trying to sound like an open-minded voice of reason, and that he's willing to lay out all the evidence both for and against the existence of the Deathly Hallows. And yet, after laying out all the evidence for and against in such a reasonable fashion, he again chooses to call them, quote, obstinate believers with, quote, wild claims. So after luring you by pretending to take a diplomatic approach, this makes his condescending dismissal of true believers sound even more damning. Now, does he discredit believers because he's a member of the controlled opposition, pretending to be a voice of reason even though he secretly wants the Hallows for his own purposes? Or does he simply want to protect those he loves from harm, knowing that if they know the Hallows are real, that they will search for them and possibly come to a bad end? It's hard to say for certain, and now that he's gone, we may never know with complete confidence. Either way, his words lend evidence to the Hallows being real. Let me explain. First, let's take an in-depth look at his commentary on the story of the 3 brothers. You can see that he realizes both that the Deathly Hallows are tempting, but also that they are ultimately bad for you. To quote him directly, he says, "Ultimately, the quest for the Elder Wand merely supports an observation I have had occasion to make many times over the course of my long life. That humans have a knack for choosing precisely those things that are worst for them." But which of us would have shown the wisdom of the 3rd brother if offered the pick of death's gifts? Wizards and muggles alike are imbued with a lust for power. How many would resist the wand of destiny? Which human being, having lost someone they loved, could withstand the temptation of the resurrection stone? Even I, Albus Dumbledore, would find it easiest to refuse the invisibility cloak, which only goes to show that, clever as I am, I remain just as big a fool as anyone else. This part of the commentary rings true to me, as it follows his general character. you see throughout the good books. He knows that he seeks power and glory, but stops himself from doing so because he's afraid of what will happen. In the Good Book, Volume 7, he reveals this aspect of his personality in a telling passage. He says, "I meanwhile was offered the post of Minister of Magic not once, but several times. Naturally I refused. I had learned I was not to be trusted with power." He goes on to explain, "I had proven as a very young man that power was my weakness and my temptation. It is a curious thing, Harry, but perhaps those who are best suited to power are those who have never sought it, those who, like you, have leadership thrust upon them, and take up the mantle because they must, and find to their own surprise that they wear it well." Dumbledore declares that he was ultimately safer at Hogwarts than in the Ministry. My question is, did he really give up all that power because he knew he would be corruptible? Did he ultimately choose the right path and leave recovery of the Hallows to others? We know that his hand was cursed because he tried to wield the Resurrection Stone. Now it's possible he was just tempted in a moment of weakness, but it's also possible that he really did want to wield the Hallows himself, and that all his talk about the non-existence of the Hallows and about how harmful it would be to wield them was nothing but talk. Talk to dissuade others from seeking the Hallows so he could wield them himself. To be fair, we also know he has a tendency to overprotect his allies by hiding the truth from them. In Harry's example, Dumbledore accidentally allowed Sirius Black to be killed because he was unwilling to tell Harry about the prophecy at such a young age. He also grooms Harry to go willingly to Voldemort like a lamb to the slaughter. He never tells Harry about this last ultimate sacrifice he must make, allowing himself to die at Voldemort's hand. But Harry says in the good books that, quote, "Dumbledore's betrayal was almost nothing," and that, quote, "Dumbledore had known Harry would not duck out, that he would keep going to the end, even though it was his end, because he had taken trouble to get to know him, hadn't he?" So we know that Dumbledore is a master groomer, a master manipulator. But it's possible he's manipulating for what he perceives to be the greater good, rather than to further his own selfish aims, that of wielding the Hallows himself. But even in this case, that shows us that he's perfectly willing to lie or not quite divulge the truth, and this for the greater good. So it's a small step from there to realize he'd be perfectly willing to lie about the existence of the Deathly Hallows in his commentary in the Tales of Beedle the Bard. He'd be lying for the greater good to dissuade young witches and wizards from becoming seekers of the Hallows. So, the tone of his commentary provides evidence that he does, in fact, know that the Hallows are real and wants to dissuade others from seeking them. A last piece of evidence for the existence of the Deathly Hallows is this. Consider the timing of the latest of J.K. Rowling's historical documentaries. We can see that J.K. Rowling is sending us a message that Grindelwald's search for the Deathly Hallows is important to us right now. But it's not just a case of history repeating in the way that the world goes through cycles of peace and cycles of war, cycles of plenty and cycles of famine. History is literally repeating in the same way that Voldemort himself rose to power twice, decades apart. The only reason Rowling would consider her message important to us now is if the Deathly Hallows are real and hold an evil power. We must see them for what they are and seek to destroy them before Grindelwald and his followers can use them.